Hey, folks, good evening. It's about a minute after. Sorry about that. Minute and a half after. I try to be punctual. And here I am, back for another reading in my book, as you all know, or you wouldn't be here. And I want to appreciate the fact that you're all here and let you know thanks. And I'm going to quote or paraphrase Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. I'm not feeling tippy-topped all day today. So the tippy-top part was hers. Technical terms, you know. But I'm doing okay now. And so if I look tired in the face, it's only because I've been kind of sitting on my butt all day. It's been one of those days. So contemplating the reading of this chapter on the Watchers. Now, as I said and made mention to you last night, it's a pretty long chapter. So we're going to go ahead and start tackling it with not much further ado. And so we have time to make some commentary. And I don't know if we'll get through the whole chapter. It all depends on how long it takes us to get where we're going. I don't know why I stuck so little into the last chapter and so much into this chapter, but we'll give it a shot. Now, as you all know, and I just like to mention for those who are coming fresh tonight, oh, look at my hair. Boy, you can tell I've been sitting in a chair all day. And is that this is a book that I wrote back in 2011. It was published in 2011 by New Page Books, my publisher, and who has since been bought out by Red Wheel Weiser over the last year. And so it's a little older book, older, if you will, written, probably about 8 years ago. And I'm going to tell you in this particular chapter on the Watchers, let me repeat something I've repeated several times over the reading of this book. And that is that not all the views expressed in this book are precisely what I hold to today. I've made some changes in my own views since this. So we're going to deal with things like aliens as a possible factor, things like that. I've got to be delicate on that because there are sometimes I want to say you have to be open to things you don't know fact about. We don't know. We weren't there. But at the same time, I'm not an alienist. I'm not an ancient alienist. Just so you all know that as we're going in. So I might make some commentary on the way as we're looking at this stuff. And we'll just take it from there. And we'll kind of let the chips fall where they may. I want to thank everybody for being here. Rocky, good to see you. Kitten, Mark, I saw... who else was here? Oh, Mr. Bush. Nice to see you. Just the tippy part, yes. Or is that tipsy part? And Casper, good to see you. I know you were smoking cigars and drinking bourbon not long ago. And she said it. To see you here. And several others of you, if I have missed anybody. Deb is here. Howdy to you too. And let's get rolling. So here we go. All right. Chapter 5 of The Rise and Fall of the Nephilim. And it's entitled The Watchers. I ought to be thy Adam, but I am rather the fallen angel. So said the creature from Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. The desire of excessive power caused the angels to fall. The desire of knowledge caused men to fall. So said Francis Bacon. And on that point, we talked about that the other night, the eating of the forbidden fruit, for as much of code language as that is. Remember, the biblical account said that the result was the humans ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the knowledge of good and evil, and have become just like gods. So said the Elohim. And I always wanted to ask the question, what did God or Elohim have against people having knowledge? That's an interesting question right there. All right, Enoch, a book found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, called them the Watchers. These non-earthly beings who seem to hold some sort of superior capacity over the inhabitants of the earth. The writer of 1 Enoch even subtitles the section of the Book of the Watchers. 1 Enoch 6 through 36. In the Aramaic, the Watchers are the Irin, which is translated as angel, Greek angelos, Coptic malach. In the Greek, the Ethiopian translations, although the commonly used Aramaic term for angel, malachah, never appears in the Book of Enoch, which is written in Aramaic. Irin is a word also found in the Old Testament's historical prophetic book of Daniel, where 3 times throughout the book the author links them directly to God's holy angels. It is in the book of Daniel that the great Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar falls into a period of madness upon seeing a watcher, a holy one, singular, come down from heaven and appear to him in a dream and prophecy. The single form of the word in this context suggests that a watcher and a holy one are 2 different titles for the same entity or caste of entities. Now remember, I have changed my view. I don't think we're dealing with fallen angels when we're talking about Nephilim or Watchers. And we'll go on here. Let's see where I hit on this as I was writing 8 years ago. In the book of Daniel, King Nebuchadnezzar goes on to describe the message delivered to him in his dream, wherein he is told that he will be reduced to madness and shall crawl upon the ground as a beast, eating grass, and that this divinely ordered punishment is by the decree of the Watchers, and that the demand of the word by the word of the holy ones, in order that the living may know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men. Nebuchadnezzar then falls into an undefined period of mental illness and temporary insanity, after which, when he comes back to his full senses, he states, and this is in Daniel 4:34 through 37 in the Old Testament, "At the end of that time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven, and my sanity was restored. Then I praised the Most High. I honored and glorified him who lives forever. His dominion is an eternal dominion. His kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the peoples of the earth are regarded as nothing. He does as he pleases with the powers of heaven and the peoples of the earth. No one can hold back his hand or say to him, 'What have you done?' At the same time that my sanity was restored, my honor and splendor were returned to me for the glory of my kingdom. My advisors and nobles sought me out, and I was restored to my throne and became even greater than before. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything he does is right, and all his ways are just, and those who walk in pride he is able to humble." Now that's from the book of Daniel, one of the prophetic books in the Old Testament. And while we know for a fact that Nebuchadnezzar was the king of Babylon in history, you have to look at a passage like this, and it brings up a lot of questions for me. And we aren't going to get so much into the philosophical side of this because there's another time for that. But it seems to me that Elohim is a God who, in order to have people bend to his will force his hand on them, which is disturbing to me. He took Nebuchadnezzar and knocked him down a few pegs. And it wasn't until he came to his senses after eating grass on his hands and knees in the field for 7 years, according to the scripture, that he raised his head and then praised and extolled and worshiped and honored God. That's another question that we'll hit at another time. It's something to contemplate. It appears that the Watchers had made their point, and it's also clearly indicated by this passage that the Watchers themselves existed long after the rebellion of Shemyaza and his followers on Mount Hermon, and were a caste who, in their non-rebellious station, were emissaries of God, of a much higher, superior being. If nothing else, it is abundantly clear that the Watchers are here in this passage again established as being part of a hierarchy who answered to a superior authority. And you remember the flood was supposed to wipe out the Nephilim, the offspring, and that the Watchers were all put under some kind of detention. And you find in Psalm 82, you see Elohim all kicking their asses about something, which is unnamed in the passage. But go look at Psalm 82, and you'll get an idea. This is the divine council we're talking about, the Elohim. In the book of Enoch, the Watchers are angels who have been dispatched or assigned to the earth to watch over its inhabitants. But in the process of conducting their duties, they became enamored with human women. The passage in Genesis says they lusted after the women of the earth, which results in one en masse act of rebellion in which they follow the prodding of their leader Shamyaza and illicitly instruct human beings in all types of arts and practices not yet naturally developed by humans. And they, of course, enter into intimate relations and sexual procreative activity with the inferior humans. The draw for these beings to interact and have intercourse with human women must have been either very strong urge, if they indeed were angelic or superior in nature, or it was the act of beings who had a definitive purpose and a goal of interbreeding. Now, I also find it very interesting here that they go into human women, they procreate with them, they bring all these forbidden knowledges. Now, this is either mythology personified, and it's highly what's the word I'm looking? Not illustrative. It's highly symbolic. It's encoded messages, or this could be where you also get your whole ancient alienist theory, is that there were beings that led humans to do certain things. If that's the case, this is a biblical form or a scriptural Judeo-Christian scripture that talks about these beings that came down and inspired humans to do great things, taught them how to do things, taught them agriculture, taught them all these things. And so it's very interesting. But at what point did they do this is a big question for me. What were humans doing prior to that? Well, now, let's move on. Whether they were divinely appointed emissaries, part of an orderly caste of angels that held responsibility over mankind, or a race of infiltrators perceived by Earth's population as gods and spirit beings, they seemingly had the ability to choose and impregnate whomever they wished. And having had such ability clearly indicates that they were much higher on the cosmic food chain than the humans they were able to subjugate and influence at whim. The great theological question looms around whether or not they were part of the biblical accounts of fallen angels, or only labeled as such in the perception of those who first beheld and intercoursed with them. After their offspring, the Nephilim, were conceived, the Watchers carry on a systematic instruction of humans in the arts of herbology, cosmetics of all things, putting on of makeup, mirrors, weaponry, sorcery, and other technical advances that would otherwise have taken a much longer period of time for humans to develop on their own. By the way, that is cosmetics, not cosmology. It gives humanity a foisted upon boost that would not otherwise have happened in such a short period of time. This ongoing teaching was carried out by Shamyaza and the 200 Watchers who were there dwelling among the humans along with him. There are 20 leaders of these Watchers mentioned in the book of Enoch. And they are on the flip side of the page. In the book of First Enoch, the book of the Watchers, 6, 7 through 8, it says, "And these are the names of their leaders: Samlazaz, their leader, Arakelba, Ramael, Kokablel, Tamlel, Ramlel, Danel, Ezekiel, Barakil, Kijal, Asael. How would you like to be the guy that got that name? Asael. Hey, Asael. What were your mom and dad thinking? Ermaros, Batarel, Ananel, Zakleel, Semsepeel, Satarel, some of these names, Turel, Jamjael, Sarael. These are their chiefs of tens. Now, something very important to notice here is a lot of these names end with L. This is just like, this is the same L that you will find as the definition of the name God. This is where you have, like in the archangels, you had Michael or Michael, Gabriel, Raphael. All of these had that suffix at the end of the name that denoted they were of God. All right. Now let's see. Am I missing anything? I'm seeing people going LOL in there, probably talking with each other. Why can't the name be simple? You know, like Fat Tony, Toenail, Toenail. Anyway, there you. Yeah, you're onto something there, Rocky. It's because it's ancient, archaic stuff. They all had difficult to say names. According to the Book of Enoch, the Watchers who took wives had sexual intercourse with them, producing offspring, and taught forbidden knowledge, became part of the caste of fallen angels. Enoch lists their leaders by specific names and takes specific note of how many of these beings bear the name of their maker, Elohim, as I just talked about, denoted by the L at the end of the name, the EL. Other such great archangels who bore the name of God, ranking them as sons of God, B'nai Ha-Elohim, are, and I just mentioned this, Gabriel, Michael, Raphael, but they were not part of this fallen caste. All right, now I go through these names of these angels, and let's go through them a bit. I got about 10 or 12 of them here. Arakiel, also known as Arakiel, Arakael, Arasiel, Arkael, Sarquael, Arkiel, Arkas. He taught the humans the signs of the earth. However, in the Sibylline oracles, Arakael is referred to not as a fallen angel or watcher, but as one of 5 angels who led the souls of men to judgment. The other 4 being Ramael, Uriel, Samiel, and Azazel, or Azazel. Next, we have Armaros, also Armaros. In First Enoch taught men the resolving of enchantments and the casting of spells. Azazel taught men to make knives, swords, and shields, how to devise ornaments and cosmetics. How about that? He's going to teach you how to put on makeup, then teach you how to kill people with knives and swords. That's a broad spectrum of education there, I'd say. Barakael taught men astronomy, astrology, and the divining of the stars. Bezaliel, also mentioned in First Enoch, is left out of most translations due to damaged manuscripts and problematic transmission of the text. That's all we have to say about him. Chazakiel, sometimes Ezekiel, taught men the signs of the clouds, the art and the science of meteorology, and the prognostication of weather. Gadriel also taught the art of cosmetics. Kokabiel, or Kakabel, or Kokbael, or Kokbiel, or Kabael, and Kokab is a high-ranking holy angel, but in general apocryphal lore, and also in First Enoch, he is a fallen watcher, resident of the nether realms, and commands 365,000 surrogate spirits to do his bidding. Among other duties, he instructs his fellows in astrology. Penemuel taught mankind the art of writing with ink and paper, and taught the children of men the bitter and the sweet and the secrets of wisdom. Penemuel taught mankind the art. Oh, I just did that one. Sariel, also Suriel, taught mankind about the courses of the moon and tide influences, at one time regarded as forbidden knowledge. Shamyaza, also known as Shemiyazaz, Shemaziah, Shemiyaza, Shemhazi, Shemyaza, and Amazyarak, is one of the leaders of the fall from heaven and the instigator of the pact to cohabit with human women. Shamsiel, once a guardian of Eden, served as one of the two chief aides to the archangel Uriel, the other side being Hasdiel, when Uriel bore his standard into battle, and is the head of 365 legions of angels, and also crowns prayers, accompanying them to the fifth heaven. He is referred to as one of the watchers. He is a fallen angel who teaches humanity the signs of the sun. I and all the others together with them took unto themselves wives. Each chose for himself one, and they began to go in unto them and to defile themselves with them. And they taught them charms and enchantments and the cutting of roots and making them acquainted with plants. And they became pregnant, and they bare great giants, whose height was 3,000 ells, who consumed all the acquisitions of men. And when men could no longer sustain them, the giants turned against them and devoured mankind. And they began to sin against birds and beasts and reptiles and fish, and to devour one another's flesh and drink their blood. Then the earth laid accusation against the lawless ones. That was 1 Enoch 7, 1-6. Pretty wild stuff. It's like I've said, the book of Enoch is a lot like the Old Testament on crack. You get some pretty wild stuff going on in there. And by the way, it's interesting too, with all these beings that are said to have done these things, that humans supposedly had no ability to have figured these things out, or at least were supposed to accept that this is the Hebrew version or the Jewish version of how the gods taught everything mankind knows. So it's very interesting stuff. And then there's a rebellion against heaven. That's the next section here. And by the way, I want to talk about that for just a second. You think about all these things, the wars in the heaven going on and so on, and who was it? The one who was supposed to have led the the falling away, was one of the leaders of the fall from heaven, Shemyaza. And I remember I had a phone call, a good 10, more than that. It had to be in about 2008. Yeah, it's about 10, 11 years ago. I get a phone call. I have friends over for dinner, and I answer the phone, and there's a man's voice, and it's very cryptic. And he says, "Scotty Roberts, you don't know who I am. But I want to tell you that in the wars in heaven, there is a war going on for your soul, and the black crow cawed, and the ravens sang, and the light, and the blah, blah, and the blah, blah, and the blah." And he kept going and going and going. And I said, "That's very interesting." I said, "I've got guests right now." I said, "Could you send me some of that in a brochure so I could take a look at it?" And I hung up. So I don't know who that was, and never did find out. But there you go. So next time, if you ever get a call and somebody says the black crow is calling for you as the raven fights for your soul, maybe you should listen longer than I did. A rebellion against the slopes of Mount Hermon in northern Israel, making a pact to descend to the earth, take human form, and take wives from the daughters of men. Ignoring for a moment the obvious mystical aspect of angelic beings, and this seems such an inconsequential thing in current cultural mindset, where we no longer have great prohibitions against intermarriage among the races, except in racially entrenched pockets of modern civilization. And one would think that this sort of interbreeding on the part of even mythological characters is rather innocuous. There is almost a who cares aura about it. Hey, celestial being, you got it out of the human woman. Hey, more power to you. So there's this almost who cares aspect to it when we read it nowadays, until you consider the far-reaching ramifications of the actions of the watchers, especially if they are in any form true events that have been recorded. Just as we have changed the role of God as our civilized tendencies have evolved, we ascribe modern thinking to ancient prohibitions and deeds. And note that God said of himself to the prophet Amos in the pages of the Old Testament scripture, he said, "This is what he showed me. Behold, the Lord was standing beside a wall built with a plumb line in his hand. And the Lord said to me, Amos, what do you see? And I said, a plumb line. Then the Lord said, behold, I am setting the plumb line in the midst of my people Israel. I will never again pass by them. The high places of Isaac shall be made desolate, and the sanctuaries of Israel shall be laid waste. And I will rise against the house of Jeroboam with the sword." That's Amos 7:7-9. In essence, God was calling himself the standard by which Israel needed to measure up. The plumb line falls straight and true due to the laws of gravity and nature. Anything that deviates from the plumb is considered by God to be off the mark. The pact made by the watchers to impregnate human women constituted a rebellion against the laws of heaven that knocked the plumb completely off the wall. And as we shall see in chapter 8 of this book, in the section entitled The Assembly of the Sons of God, their sin was against the supreme king of the divine council of the gods, a deed worthy of divine consequences. This links the Nephilim, those who were cast down, with the fallen angels of the war in heaven, described in the book of Isaiah. In the passage, God is assuring Isaiah that their Babylonian oppressors will be brought down to size. The following passage speaks of the Babylonian king, but many have attempted to make this the fall of Lucifer, even though the passage does not implicitly say that at all. This is about the king of Tyre, I do believe, Isaiah 14:12-15. How have you fallen from heaven, morning star, son of the dawn? You have been cast down to earth, you who once laid low the nations. You who once you said in your heart, I will ascend to the throne of heaven. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will sit enthroned on the mount of assembly, on the utmost heights of Mount Zephon, one of the most sacred mountains in Canaan, to the Canaanites, by the way. I will ascend above the tops of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High, but you are brought down to the realm of the dead, to the depths of the pit. So says the passage. The trouble with many of these Old Testament prophecies is that they seemingly start talking about one thing, but then click over mid-sentence into making spiritual word pictures of a completely different notion or event altogether. It's rather like having a talk about your backyard bird feeders over a cup of coffee with a friend, then watching his eyes turn to a fervent, glossy stare as he begins to speak to you about the wings of the black raven, spreading their shadow over your soul. I'm obviously making reference to that phone call. This actually happened to me once. See, I didn't even remember this was in here. This actually happened to me once, so don't laugh. At any rate, God seems to lapse into prophetic mode while seemingly relating information about something completely different, and usually without warning or notice. The casual reader of these prophetic messages of Scripture would have to draw the conclusion that the passage is either complete in its thoughts about the king of Babylon, or that the God who delivered the message has and I mean no disrespect or blasphemy by this, those sensitive to this religion, that God seems to have some kind of attention deficit disorder problem when transmitting hidden meanings in the midst of what is a completely different description altogether on the surface. And, this is like I have said, if some of these things that were taught in Sunday school and church were true, why did not God make himself more explicitly understandable He expects, it seems, the finite mind of humans to understand the infinite without giving a description or telling you any more solid information, especially nowadays, than that which you can read in a 2,000-year-old scroll, which is long lost. We only have copies of that. So anyway, let's move on. Also interesting to note in this passage is the reference to the Mount of Assembly. Here contains a veiled reference to the divine council. That's 1 Enoch 7:10. Then they took wives, each choosing for himself who they began to approach and with whom they cohabited, teaching them sorcery, incantations, and all the secret things which are done in the heavens. This is the real sin of the Watchers, laid bare. They shared a powerful, forbidden secret with mankind, and as Enoch says, men were not born for this. As we saw, each of the leaders of the Watchers taught some specialized field of knowledge, such as astronomy, the manufacture of goods, the dyeing of textiles, the making and application of cosmetics, and so on. And certainly, although the teaching of such things as sorcery and astrology may have been viewed as ungodly and taboo at the time, despite these things having taken place long before Mosaic law and written prohibitions, one of the Watchers, Benemuel, stands accused of something as simple as teaching men to understand writing and the use of ink and paper. This seems to be a very out-of-place prohibition. Even Enoch himself is described as a scribe of righteousness and is credited with the Muslim Quran with being the inventor in the Muslim Quran as being the inventor of mathematics, writing, and astronomy. Bite on that for a while. Chew on that for a second. Berosus of Babylon, a 3rd century BCE Hellenistic era Babylonian writer born near the beginning of Alexander the Great's reign, an astronomer and priest of Bel-Marduk, speaks of the half-man or half-fish god Oannes as having engaged in similar forms of activity as the Watchers. He would rise up out of the sea each morning and teach unknown arts and knowledges, only without the inherent prohibition of those said knowledges being forbidden by a superior deity or set of theological rules. So, setting aside the Watchers' acts of cohabitation with and impregnation of human women, the Book of Enoch tells us that the teaching of forbidden knowledge to humanity seems to be the overt crime committed by the Watchers. If you read between the lines and root out the unwritten subtext of the book, it would almost seem as if the hidden message is that knowledge begets evil. Like the Amish and the Pennsylvania Dutch, who shun technological advance, believing it distracts them from a closer walk with God and is the source of all the world's sins and woes, the author of the Book of Enoch is telling us that higher understanding was contrary to primeval man's true nature and resulted inevitably in corruption, judgment, and eventual punishment. It's like handing a child a loaded gun. He may have some concept of what the thing does, but he can create a world of havoc and tragedy when wielding it all on his own. And this is like I mentioned last night or the night before. It talks about when Adam and Eve ate of the forbidden fruit offered to them by Nakash, the serpent character in the garden. That Elohim said that the humans have eaten of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and have become just like us. Let us therefore go down and prevent them from eating also of the tree of life, lest they become like gods. So it's very interesting. What did God have against his creation having knowledge? And that's, of course, presuming, this whole thing is presuming that the biblical mythology is what we're tracing here, and that these are the things that happen. So that's what we're looking at here. But of course, we have the opposite side of the argument from a more conservative evangelical theologians, who, if they even broach the topic of the Watchers and the Nephilim at all, will quickly point out how they believe these things are part of the Luciferian fall after the war in heaven, And as if God had no control over his creations, these minions of Lucifer set about a campaign to infiltrate the human bloodline and thereby infect the pure blood of the human race, leaving no possibility for the pure human bloodline of the prophesied Messiah, the kinsman redeemer we talked about the other night, to ever take hold. The great sin that, and this is what I learned this in evangelical theology, was that Satan came down and tried to mix the bloodlines to prevent humanity from ever being able to have the Messiah born. That's interesting. That's how the evangelicals looked at it. The great sin, then, of the Watchers was not just the teaching of ancient forbidden wisdom, but an all-out assault on the one and only begotten Son of God, who had not yet been conceived. However, were this the stratagem incorporated by the fallen demonic minions of Satan when they waited 7 long generations to begin their tactical? Let's look at my next section is Watcher Psych 101. Now let's take a look here. I just want to see if anybody had anything here to say. No fruit from the tree for Adamites. Casper, it helps to have your own studio to process the film. Indeed. By stalling or removing genomes. Yeah, it's like I've said many times, something catastrophic, cataclysmic happened to the human race here. It's trying to figure out what. Is this just a version, a mythological version? One of many. Watcher Psych 101. The Book of Enoch is more of an accurate record of how the Watchers were perceived within a framework of antediluvian worship of God than it is a reflection of who the Watchers really were or what they really did. In these accounts of the fallen cast of Watchers, we are given very little insight as to what their intent was, or into their personalities, or their motivations. We only know that they lusted, sought out, and carried through with the plan that they were convinced was something they should carry out, but that would also bring down the wrath of God upon their heads. See, they seem to know this because they admitted it ahead of time. God's going to get us for this, but we're going to do it anyway. Was this because they cockily believed that they could overthrow God, that this was post-war in heaven? Did they believe God wasn't paying attention, wasn't watching? If this is the God, the omnipotent, all-knowing, all-powerful God that we were taught exists, why would these beings who were so much closer to him on a theological scale than even humanity, who are separated from him? How could we believe that they thought, as the divine council, that this was a good thing to do and that they'd get away with it? It's like all mythologies. This is why Shemyaza was second-guessing the decision, and why he looked pleadingly to the others of his kind to bolster him in his decision. They, in response, joined in with him and set the pact in concrete. Their devilish intent and malicious blood play are ascribed later by scholars and researchers who parse the texts with ecclesiastical intent, or are merely disingenuous with the context when it falls outside their theological or denominational belief. Never once in the passages about the Watchers does it say they descended with intent to thwart the bloodlines of the coming Messiah, which is what evangelical theology claims they were doing. But that very sin has been ascribed by the authors of the text. It is axiomatic that people have an innate fear and mistrust of those whom they perceive as knowing more than they do, and most certainly of those who wield a greater power over them. It is also given, just as Machiavelli said, that people fear, resist, and rise against any brand of change that accompanies new knowledge and new ideas. This is precisely what the Watchers brought into the ancients. Change, revolutionary and evolutionary concepts, and knowledge, the sweet, fruity filling of forbidden knowledge, baked with a pie crust of taboo and prohibition. But the corruption seems to go far beyond the mere transmission of knowledge and wisdom. The offspring of the Watchers were guilty. The offspring were guilty of grievous crimes against mankind that Enoch equates to the whole earth as being filled with blood, and the souls of those who perished at their hands, crying in some dreadful ghostly complaint to gain the attention, if not the vengeance, of God Almighty. Thou hast seen what Azazel has done, how he has taught every species of iniquity upon earth, and has disclosed to the world all the secret things which are done in the heavens. Shemyaza also has taught sorcery, to whom thou hast given authority over those who are associated with him. They have gone together to the daughters of men, have lain with them, have become polluted, and have discovered crimes to them. The women likewise have brought forth giants. Thus has the whole earth been filled with blood and with iniquity. And now behold, the souls of those who are dead, cry out and complain even to the gate of heaven. Their groaning ascends, nor can they escape from the unrighteousness which is committed on earth. Thou knowest all things before they exist. Thou knowest these things and what has been done by them, yet thou dost not speak to us. What on account of these things ought we to do to them? And that's 1 Enoch 9, 5 through 14. And right here in that passage, it's admitting what people were being taught at the time. And what they know is that God knows all things before they even exist or happen. And they know, and he knows all things that were done to these people. And yet he doesn't speak to them. He remains silent. It's like I wrote something way back when I was a younger man out of seminary. I was struggling with certain things and struggling with my faith. And I wrote this little phrase that said, God wrestles with man in the night times of our lives, but at daybreak, he's gone. And that's pretty much how God seems today. He's just not there. He doesn't answer. He doesn't. And this is why people are willing to go astray from that, even those who have been raised in that, because they feel there is a God that does not care or does not exist. And you go looking and you find it even in this old ancient stuff. Same thing. Naturalness of awareness is synonymous with wisdom. Let me say it again. Naturalness of awareness is synonymous with wisdom. True wisdom. And true wisdom holds a true power, not to oppress or manipulate, but to enlighten and illuminate. It's a power that is innate in every single being. In ancient times, however, wisdom was synonymous with power, and power, especially for those who did not possess it, was more often than not perceived to be synonymous with oppression. Indeed, the Nephilim were accused of such when it was written. 1 Enoch 10, and the reason I'm going through and quoting a lot of these passages, so you can see exactly what they say without having the book of Enoch sitting on the bedside next to you while you read this. All the earth has been corrupted by the effects of the teaching of Azazel. To him, therefore, ascribe the whole crime. To Gabriel, also the Lord said, go to the biters, to the reprobates, to the children of fornication, and destroy the children of fornication, the offspring of the Watchers, from among men. Bring them forth and excite them with one against the other. Let them perish by mutual slaughter, for length of days shall not be theirs. Destroy all the souls addicted to dalliance and the offspring of the Watchers, for they have tyrannized over mankind. Let every oppressor perish from the face of the earth. Let every evil work be destroyed. And that's 1 Enoch 10, 12 through 13 and 18 through 20. Man, doesn't it makes it almost sound like there was some guy, a very sexually uptight guy who wrote that. You wonder about that stuff. It's like the Catholic Church in the recent last week burning Harry Potter books and the like because they said it will kill the evil spirits in them. So, as is common in apocryphal Jewish texts, as well as mythological tales from around the world, the oppressors in the tales are ascribed attributes of enormously epic proportion. In the Book of Enoch, the offspring of the Watchers, the Nephilim, are described as a race of giants who committed acts against both mankind and nature to monstrous mythical degrees. Listen to this. 1 Enoch 7:11-14. Then they took wives, each choosing for himself, whom they began to approach, and with whom they cohabited, teaching them sorcery, incantations, the dividing of roots and trees, and the women conceiving brought forth giants, whose stature was each 300 cubits. Remember, a cubit is elbow to fingertips. So, and Goliath, who was a little over 9 feet, was 6 cubits and a span. So 300 cubits. These devoured all which the labor of men produced, until it became impossible to feed them, when they turned themselves against men in order to devour them, and began to injure birds, beasts, reptiles, and fish, to eat their flesh one after the other, and to drink their blood. Now, you wonder, with giants of this size, it said something like they had to eat like 800 goats a day or something like that to exist. They were something like 36 to 40 feet tall. Now, when you have beings like this, and there's a whole race of them, how many hours or days went by before they pretty much consumed everything that was there? Was this a century? Was it a week? Was it a month? Was it an hour? Pretty mythological in proportions. They consumed birds and fish, devouring their flesh one after another and drinking their blood. This resembles the highly exaggerated claim of a peasant tenant who watches his feudal overlords feast on fatted calves and flambeaued fowl, while he and his family subsist on the broth of roots and bark, with a side helping of gruel. And then he makes up horrible stories about it to exaggerate his classist angst. However, most major religions and countless legends and mythologies speak of a time when giants walked the earth. Why would diverse and widely separated traditions all make the same outrageous claims unless it has some basis in truth somewhere? All myth and legend have at their primordial headwaters some kernel of fact and truth. And if that truth was not there at the core, what are the odds that all these traditions could concoct such similar stories to one another? In the Watchers, we see an emerging prototype of Satan, the adversary, the deceiver, the accuser, the liar. We can also see a variation on the theme of original sin, just as with Eve and the forbidden fruit, and the sin of the Watchers involved a specific combination of infractions, having to do with both disobedience and knowledge. And in a very real sense, Cain, the firstborn of Adam and Eve, became the first of the Nephilim. He was bequeathed the first of the Nephilim, as we mentioned once before. If one were to look behind the mythic elements of the story of the Watchers, there are many various historical events that could come to the forefront in ways to explain the spread of such incredible tales. But what ought to intrigue us all beyond the fanciful stories is the persistence of the myth itself, the ongoing story of a race of gods and their descendants who somehow come to be perceived as demonic. All right? Now, we're about 10 pages into a 48-page chapter, 12 pages. So we're going to keep going here, but I'm just going to look back here and see. I don't know if I was watching Murder, Rape, Pillage, and Evil and was in my power as God, I would care enough to do something. She said it, you said it. That's the thing. And this is one of the things about free will, I think, that has plagued and befuddled humans since they learned about it. I had always asked this question. Now, bear with me on this. This is all an aside to the book. I've asked the question, if God indeed offers salvation from such a terrible place as a hell, which is, by definition, in theology, a eternal or unending, infinite separation from the love and presence of God. If that is such a very real thing, and the infiniteness of it is so real and tangible, why did a loving, all-knowing God leave it to the free will of the finite minds of humans to make the decision not to go there, based solely on what they read in old texts that have no veracity beyond an element of faith in the unknown? I look at that and I say, I would think that a God, far be it from me to psychoanalyze God or to say I know better than God or anything like that. It's not what I'm saying here. But far be it from me to think that I know the mind of an infinite God, if he does exist. But I don't understand that. I don't understand that thinking. I have little children that I love so much that if I knew that their steps were going to bring them to disaster, I would warn them. I would warn them again and again and again. I'd go stop them if I could. Now I realize there are situations where sometimes you have to let even your own kids go and make their mistakes. I get that. But you let them make their mistakes for the reason, the sole purpose of having them learn the lesson and turn from it and move to something better. Not to have them fall into a pit of eternal fire forever and you would never see them again. This is something I don't understand about the love of God and the free will that God supposedly imbued us with. You have free will given to you by God as long as you use it to express a love for him. If you use your free will to do anything else, that free will enslave you to infinite hellfire and separation from God, so far as I can understand it. That, I'm not saying it's wrong. You don't get me wrong here. I'm not saying it's wrong definitively. I'm saying it doesn't feel right. So there has to be something more to it. All right? The rat bastard God, exactly, Janine. Or Jeannie. That's exactly it. That's what Jeff's been talking about. Unindoctrinate yourself. All right, I'm sitting crooked on my chair. So let me get my butt settled again here. Let's move on. Where their feet hit the ground is the next section. The Watchers, they first appeared on the scene in Sumer, or Shumer. It seems literally means the land of the Watchers. For American author Zecharia Sitchin, they are alien beings for whose specific task is to orbit the Earth and monitoring events on Earth. For Sitchin, the Watchers are not a race or a species. They are merely a job specification. Their colleagues had abandoned their ships and had landed on Earth. They continued to orbit the Earth. Those who did land either mated or genetically engineered mankind into its preset form. As a consequence, mankind worshipped the Watchers as gods. Now, by the way, I have a big problem with Zecharia Sitchin. I'm stating here in this chapter, and again, I have not reviewed this. I'm reading this back to me as I read it. But I'm going to tell you, Zecharia Sitchin tried to squeeze too many large square pegs into too many very small holes. And his scholarship was faulty. His linguistics were faulty. I don't buy half of what he says. And the other half I see as good storytelling. So I am using his work to illustrate some points here. So let's move on. Going a step further back, however, it's recorded in the Book of Enoch that those so-called Watchers descended first to the slopes and foothills of Mount Hermon, or Ha-Harmon in Hebrew, also known as Jabal el-Saki, Shaykh in Aramaic, meaning mountain of the chief. Now we got Jabal el-Shaykh. Oh, it's Sheikh, I think, just like the word sheik or sheikh. Jabal el-Shaykh, meaning mountain of the chief. The mountain is actually a cluster of mountains made up of 3 distinct summits that straddle the current-day border between Lebanon and Syria in the highly political, much disputed Golan Heights region of northern Israel. To set it in more modern context, it was this mountain that exchanged hands back and forth between Israel and Syria during the Six-Day War in 1967 and the Yom Kippur War of 1973. On this mountain, it is said the Watchers first descended to the earth and made their pact to cohabitate with human women and teach forbidden skills to mankind. Now, I know it's really tough to see this here, and I'm not set up at the moment to show you things, but you can see right there, there's a picture of Mount Hermon, or Mount Hermon, the 3 peaks in Lebanon, just on the north of Israel. Let's see. In the occult science of numerology, the number 33, now this is an interesting tidbit I picked up along the way, and I thought you might enjoy this, and that's why I put this in the book. And it lends to the whole mystical element of all of this. In the occult science of numerology, the number 33 represents the ultimate attainment of consciousness. Keep that in mind now, because it's a very interesting thing to note that the geographic location of Mount Hermon, the very place where the Watchers are said to have descended to the earthly plane, lies on the 33rd parallel, which is a latitude of 33 degrees north of the equator. If you trace, now this is the interesting part. If you have not heard this before, 8 years ago, this was brand new knowledge to me. If you trace the 33rd parallel to the exact geographic global opposite from Mount Hermon, meaning in other words, the other side of the earth on the 33rd parallel, you'll find yourself directly on top of the most controversially mythic place in current ufological history, and that's Roswell, New Mexico. Mount Hermon, where the Watchers descended to the earth, and Roswell, New Mexico, are exact polar opposites on the same 33rd degree north latitude. The global coordinates of Mount Hermon and Roswell crash site are no accident and speak to some darker, perhaps secretive significance. Now, here's where I get a bit conspiratorial or mysterious. I quote Bill Burns here. If you remember him, he was on Ancient Aliens for a long time. He published UFO magazine. He was on UFO Hunters on the History Channel for a long time. Bill Burns said to me, if aliens used the 33rd latitudinal line as a waypoint and landing point for planet Earth, what biblical people saw thousands and thousands of years ago on Mount Hermon were entities that came down from the sky. They just simply called them angels. Now, put that in your pipe and smoke it for a while. So these 2 significant sites are on the 33rd parallel, Mount Hermon and the controversial Roswell, New Mexico on the other side of the planet. Could the Watchers who descended to the slopes of Mount Hermon thousands of years ago and the UFOs that reportedly crashed at Roswell in 1947 be from the same extraterrestrial race? Now, that's a big question, because I have said extraterrestrial, I've said many times while we're talking here, doesn't necessarily mean alien, it just means not of this earth. Then you've got Zecharia Sitchin, who came along and said all these people flew spaceships and landed here on Mount Hermon. Then you've got this mythic site and this mythic site, which kind of line up with each other. So, if these 2 events spanning the entirety of human recorded history indeed involve alien races, then they have been with us for the long haul, since the beginning of time, and it begs the question of whether or not they were left behind to monitor us or to help establish and guide our civilizations and culture, just like all these beings did when they went into human women. And the even bigger question, are they still among us today? Some Christian ufologists, such as Chuck Missler, believe that the sons of God in Genesis 6:2 are actually extraterrestrials or gray aliens, and that these beings are actually fallen angels or demons that have appeared during the antediluvian times in order to genetically alter the human race and to pollute the bloodline of Jesus. Thus, the Nephilim would be the hybrid race of these beings in this view. What do you think about that? Now, I threw that in because I wanted to throw that particular train of thought into this book and ask the reader, and now you, the listener, if you believe that these beings could be something that is of extraterrestrial origin, not just celestial, not just angelic or godly, made of God or something like that, but it's something completely different. Star Trek type stuff. What do you think? Let's move on. You cogitate on that a bit. Let's see. We're on page 96. We started at page 81, and this chapter goes to, just so you know, all the way up to turning to page 128. So we've got 22 pages left to read, and we've read 15 so far. So that gives you an idea of the length of this chapter. So we'll start now. We'll keep going. And if anybody says, hey, look, quit now. It's getting late. It's now 11. We've been going for an hour. Let's see where we get in the next half hour to 45 minutes. All right. Sumer. The land of Sumer or Shinar of the Bible, literally land of the watchers or land of the bright shining ones, as it has been identified in Mesopotamia's Fertile Crescent region, is modern-day Iraq. It's the place where the Watchers and their offspring of the Nephilim had their first great influence on human history, or at least this is where they made their prehistoric tangible mark on humanity, beyond their initial contact and intercourse. On today's map, the land of Sumer lay roughly 400 miles east, as the crow flies, from the slopes of Mount Hermon, which is just a few miles northeast of Damascus. That seems like quite a distance to cover from the Watchers' geographic touchdown on the planet to where they bore the greatest influence in mankind's earliest of histories. But it's extremely important to take note of the region and all its connectivity to likely or early biblical and Middle Eastern religious accounts. For hundreds of years, we regarded Egypt as the world's oldest of civilizations. But now the land of the pharaohs has been relegated to the periphery of the civilized world in the 4th and 3rd millennia BCE. Despite the progress of archaeology and anthropology, we still know very little about the history of the peoples of the Mesopotamian regions prior to 2500 BCE. And the Sumerians seem to rise suddenly out of nowhere, predating Egyptian culture by at least 1500 to 2000 years. In speaking of the Sumerian culture, Carl Sagan once remarked that we still have no clear perspective about their origin. Their language is foreign. It shows no resemblance to Indo-European, Semitic, or any other language. We can only map them by the actions of their successors, the Akkadians, who created a voluminous Sumerian-Akkadian dictionary. The Sumerian culture of ancient Mesopotamia is the earliest human civilization known to contemporary science and the archaeological record, and Sumer's sudden onset of civilized culture remained a mystery for many, many years, despite representing an exponential quantum leap in humanity's intellectual development. It all began about 6,000 years ago when the very first cuneiform writing was developed by the Sumerians to record a dramatic astronomical event, the visible starburst of Vela 10, a star that went supernova about 1,300 light years away from our solar system. It can still be seen today as a faintly flashing pulsar. Virtually overnight, in evolutionary terms, the Sumerians gave the written language, the first fundamental character of which was the Sumerian symbol for the word star. Commemorating the astronomical event, the cuneiform word was then linked to the symbol for deity, and the term star god was born. Let me see, I saw some things being typed in here. I'm good here, it says she said it. I'm on the Pacific side, says Jeannie. So far, the spirit of the rods agree, but say much is just a way of explaining this so people can comprehend. You're onto something there, Brian. So are the rods. I should have my own rods out, but they're still packed away. Let's see. In the blink of an eye, historically speaking, the Sumerians gave humanity written language when it had never before existed. The ancient Sumerians left behind in the ruined mounds of their ancient cities cuneiform tablets that listed everything from the spiritual form of worship to the mundane business receipts drawn up between merchants. The Sumerians in their written language gave us the first love song, the first prescription of pharmaceutical concoctions, all without any inclusion of magic or spirituality. The first school system, the first law code of jurisprudence, and the first parliament. And it all came out of nowhere in the twinkling of a bursting supernova. Why is this contextual to the Watchers? Because it was the Watchers who, according to the Book of Enoch, brought these skills to ancient Sumerians. And not only the Watchers, but other races that are recorded in the annals of ancient history and religious spirituality. All of the sightings of ancient godlike entities appearing in various cultures, teaching mankind advanced skills, can all be collectively lumped together as superstitious myth building. But all myth and legend have at their core at least a kernel of truth and fact. The skeptic will ask you to cite evidences that other species interfered in the evolutionary ascendancy of mankind's civilization, while at the same time ignoring, or at least the very least watering down, the pan-cultural evidence that already abundantly exists. It merely boils down to your leaping off point. That point, with the skeptically and scientifically minded, climates the possibility of spiritual or extraterrestrial influence, as they seek to merely boil all anthropological studies down to what humanity achieved on its own accord. The possibility of external influence in cultural development, or physiological development for that matter, is eliminated as a possibility because it smacks of too much superstition and unfounded spurious claims. Yet the spiritual historical documents, or documentation of every culture, possesses an exponential thread of commonality in that they all express similarities. Even the Bible itself, in many fables and Judeo-Christian mythologies, has an underlying code that exposes at least the possibility that there was influence from a more supreme being or race of infiltrators set on tangibly altering the course of hominid development and cultural establishment. It can't all be chalked up to supernatural myth. Next session is religious mythology versus alien influence. So much of what we read and interpret as mythology, especially from ancient, are things in our modern, much more advanced cultural dispatch with a broad swath. We tend to do this so we can claim a higher intellectual ground than that of our ancestors, avoiding any possibility of being labeled as superstitious or appearing as if our theories and conclusions are being drawn from outmoded ways of perception and thinking. But what if the old superstitions and mythologies just might be true, and we only label them as being myth because they lie outside the realm of a more sterile scientific view? In a universe as vast as the physical one, in which we are the only tiniest drop in the motion of a vast, endless blue sparkling sea, there are obviously more things at play than we can possibly fathom or even conceive in our wildest imaginations. So instead of brushing aside the mythologies as irrelevant and lacking in any substantive fact, let's take the opposite approach and examine some of what's been left for us to consider by our ancient forebears. Okay, this says, treat the rods with respect, no frivolous or personal profit questions. I recommend reading the Corpus Hermeticum. It explains our relationship to our Creator. Good advice there, Brian. I've used the rods. I have a pair of rods that John Ward had made for me from a artisan in Luxor, Egypt, out of cast iron. And they're very lightweight, when you think of it. But they're all hand-hewn and very cool. And very effective. Oannes, the fisherman. In the 3rd century BCE, Ancient Aliens episode is on now, talking about the Watchers. How about that? So says Audrey. Thank you, Audrey. I'm not going to watch it. If you all want to go watch that, I suppose you can. You can catch this later. In the 3rd century BCE, Babylonian priest historian Berosus chronicled the coming of the Anedoti and their leader Oannes, a race described as being half human, half fish, that surfaced from the Persian Gulf to instruct the early inhabitants of Mesopotamia in the arts of culture and civilization. According to the chronicles of Berosus, the ancient Sumerians were like beasts of the fields, prior to the arrival of Oannes, living under no law, order, or conduct of governance. It was this half-fish, half-man entity who surfaced, appearing in the midst of the Sumerians, and though described in the writings of Berosus as being frightfully hideous in appearance, spoke with superior intelligence, ability, and instruction for the prehistoric, uncivilized Mesopotamians. According to Berosus, the leader of the Anedoti fishmen, Oannes would rise up out of the sea every morning and instruct the people in all manner of arts and insights, into all manner of letters and sciences. Oannes taught them how to construct houses, to found and build temples, and how to compile laws and codes of conduct, and explained to them the principles of geometric knowledge, all things that were necessary to devise and construct a cohesive, civilized culture. Oannes also taught the art of agriculture and discerning of seeds and fruits and all manner of husbandry. In short, it is said by Berosus, Oannes humanized the savage, uncivilized humans that lived as ununified, scattered animals in the wilds of Mesopotamia. And I always wondered how a half-fish, half-man could teach you how to farm, and could teach you how to build a temple, and could teach you civilized culture and the discerning of seeds and fruits. So very interesting stuff when you think about the stories. The appearance of a reptilian-like entity exists all throughout human history. Oannes is simply one version of this extraterrestrial form of entity, the half-man, half-fish, walking on two legs, possessing superior intelligence and the ability to communicate and teach specific knowledge to a lesser advanced humanity. Many ancient cultures have legends of amphibians or serpent people who serve as teachers and instruct ancient mankind in the arts of civilization. Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent of the Aztecs, descended from heaven on a silver egg. The strikingly handsome Naga were the semi-divine serpent people with the supernatural powers who figure in the Hindu and Buddhist traditions. The shadowy recesses of history are rife with the mentions of mythical sky people who were emissaries of the flying serpent. The snake-worshipping Mayans and the Aztecs bear striking resemblance to the Chinese, who worshipped a celestial dragon. There are even reptilian characters that rise up in the Genesis account of creation and the first family. And by the way, that last paragraph is the follow-up, what prompted the follow-up, the rise or the secret history of the Reptilians, the book that I followed this book with. The Dogon Nomos. The Nomos are the ancestral spirits, sometimes referred to as deities, hailing from the star Sirius B and worshipped by the Dogon tribe of Mali, West Africa. Their villages situated around the arid Bandagara escarpment. The word nomos is derived from a Dogon word meaning to make one drink. They are described as being frog-like creatures in both their amphibious and hermaphroditic physiologies. The nomos were said to have been quite ugly, beings that resembled mermen and mermaids. They also appear in Babylonian, Akkadian, and the Sumerian myths of the Anandati and the Oannes. The Egyptian goddess Isis, who is sometimes depicted as a mermaid, is also linked with the Sirius Dogon folk art depicts the nomos as creatures with the upper torsos of human beings and the legs and feet of an amphibian with fish-like tail. The Dogon also referred to the ancient nomos as masters of the water, the monitors, and the teachers. We see in Dogon mythology a commonality shared by many creation mythologies, the introduction of multiple births at the point of creation, and this element of multiple births is even seen in the Genesis account of Adam and Eve's twin sons, Cain and Abel. In the case of the nomos, the multiplicity is demonstrated by the mutation of a single entity into multiples. Nomos, the singular entity representing the race of nomos, was the first living creature, or Nomo was the first living creature of the nomos, created by their sky god, Ama. Soon after, Namo underwent a transformation mutation and developed into 4 pairs of twins. One of the twins rebelled against, and remember by the way, the Ogdode and the 8, the 4 pairs. One of the twins rebelled against the universal order created by Ama. And to restore order to his creation, Ama sacrificed one of the multiple Namo progeny, dismembered his body, and scattered it through the universe. This dispersal of body parts is seen by the Dogon as the source for the proliferation of Bainu shrines throughout the Dogon tradition and history. Whenever a body part fell, a shrine was erected. In the latter 1940s, from 4 Dogon priests related to French anthropologists, and by the way, on this account, there's been a lot of skepticism, not that it took place, but of the veracity of the claims of these 2 anthropologists, named Marcel Guiraud and Germain Dieterlen, who had been working with the Dogon since 1931. Here's the claim. It's a belief that the nomos, according to the Dogon legend, lived on a planet that orbits a star in the Sirius system, identified as Sirius B. The nomos landed on Earth in an ark that made a spinning descent to the ground with great noise and wind, like that of thunder and fire. The Dogon apparently possessed traditional astronomical knowledge about Sirius and its 2 companion stars that would normally be considered impossible without the use of telescopes. Of course, skeptics have attributed this intimate knowledge of the stars to cultural contamination, possibly even introduced by the anthropologists themselves. However, that skeptical observation is considered by most to be far too simplistic a speculation. After arriving, the nomos required a watery environment in which to exist, immediately set about the task of constructing a reservoir of water, and subsequently dove in. According to the myth related to Grial and Dieterlen, the Nomo divided his body among men to feed them. That is why it is also said that the universe had drunk of his body. The Nomo also made men drink. He gave all his life principles to human beings. According to the Dogon legend, the Nomo was crucified on a tree, but was resurrected and returned to his home world. Dogon legend has it that he will return in the future to revisit the earth in human form. How about that? And now we go on to a new section. That brings us to page 102. And I'm just keeping track so you know where we're at. And again, we go all the way up to a page 126, I think it was. So we're at 102. We've got, further than that, 128. So we've got roughly 25 pages to go, 26. So let's look back at some of the comments, and you let me know if you want to hold off here, and we'll pick it up tomorrow night. I'm good to go. It's all if you are. It gets long listening after an hour, especially an hour and 20 minutes. Okay, let's see. I've wondered since my youth about how being taught cultivation art was considered evil or the sinful. The rat bastard didn't want man to advance or take care of the earth. Brian Parker, you hit on something there, because doesn't the rat bastard, as Jeff refers to him, ask Adam and Eve to be good conservatives and stewards of the earth? Interesting. Let's see. Hamlet's Mill, free on, yep. Hamlet's Mill is a good place to listen. I subscribe to your channel. That's Jeannie. Brian to Jeannie, sorry. Little personal interlude there for those two. So many religious references, yes. I try to keep them at a height here, Audrey, so we can see how it fits into all of these. Jeannie says she doesn't have a channel. Someday she'll get one. Keep reading, says Audrey. Captivating, says Mark. If you want to read, says Jeannie. Keep rolling, says Brian. I'm good, says Mark. So there we go. Why don't we just keep forging ahead? Let me take another drink here. Keep my whistle wet. And I will say to those latecomers, if I look really tired, it's only because I didn't feel very good today. Fine in the head. Physically, it was a bit of doo-doo today. So let's move on. The serpent in the Garden of Eden. Now, I'm going to rearrange my... Hold on, I've got to shift my chair here because I've somehow shifted it to the side while I was reading. And it's become very uncomfortable to sit on. It's a high kind of bar stool. My high illustration table here. Okay, so now let's move on. The serpent in the Garden of Eden. Now the serpent was more crafty than any of the wild animals the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, "Did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden?" Genesis 3:1. The original paradise that rolled off the creative fingertips of God, as stated in the biblical account, is more than simple lore or myth. Despite all the spiritual mythos built up around the Garden of Eden's existence, understanding its geographic location and the events that the Bible says took place there are the first stepping stones to understanding the descent of the Watchers and the influence of external entities and races. We're going to take a bit of a diversion in this section in order to establish some background on the character known as the serpent in the Garden of Eden. Now, I keep referencing him as Nakash. Let's dig in a little bit here. According to the book of Genesis, Eden lay in the regions between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, with the Pishon and the Gihon streams flanking. It says in Genesis 2:10 through 14, water flowed from Eden. From there it was separated into 4 headwaters. The name of the first is the Pishon. It winds through the entire land of Havilah, where there is gold. The gold of that land is good. Aromatic resin and onyx are also there. The name of the second river is the Gihon. It winds through the entire land of Cush. The name of the third river is the Tigris. It runs along the east side of Ashur. And the fourth river is the Euphrates. But all of this intimate geography may have been altered significantly during the Great Flood, which covered, as the Bible says, the entire surface of the world, even to the tops of the highest mountain peaks. See, I have a question that came in here in a different place. Hold on here just a second. And I just want to hit it. See if I'm supposed to be following up on it. Yeah, I don't see it. Well, there it is. Okay, never mind. Something, not a question pertinent to the reading. It's a question about something else. Now, here's what the passage says in Scripture, Genesis 7:17 through 24. For 40 days the flood kept coming to the earth, and the waters increased as they lifted the ark high above the earth. The waters rose and increased greatly on the earth, and the ark floated on the surface of the water. They rose greatly on the earth, and all the high mountains under the entire heavens were covered. The waters rose and covered the mountains to a depth of more than 15 cubits. That's roughly 23 feet or 6.8 meters. Every living thing that moved on the land perished. Birds, livestock, wild animals, all the creatures that swam over the earth, and all mankind. Everything on dry land that had the breath of life in its nostrils died. Every living thing on the face of the earth was wiped out. People and animals and the creatures that move along the ground and the birds were wiped from the earth. Only Noah was left, and those with him in the ark. The waters flooded the earth for 150 days. All right? Now, here we go. Moving on. There has been much debate over the land surface that was actually engulfed by the Great Flood. If the purpose of the flood was to destroy all life on the entire planet, then an earth-enveloping deluge is what would have been necessary, even though early human civilization existed only in the Fertile Crescent region of the earth. In the ancient way of understanding and evaluating, the entire earth encompassed only the areas that were known to the people alive at the time. Anything else existing on the opposite side of the globe was simply far beyond understanding or comprehension. Some ancient cultures even illustrated the Mesopotamian region as being an island surrounded by infinite horizons of water. If the Great Flood were a more localized event, it may have simply engulfed the entirety of the Mesopotamian region, consisting of the Tigris and Euphrates River valleys. Covering that would have been the highest of mountains in that antediluvian geography. A massive flood of nature described in the Bible would have altered the landscape significantly, so that the actual location of the Garden of Eden is impossible to pinpoint by today's geographic markers. Wherever Eden actually lay on the map, it's clear that it was situated somewhere in the great Mesopotamian river valleys, in relatively close proximity to the rising Sumerian civilization and the earliest of cities built in the region. And I just want you to see this. This is a little map I made for this book. You're not going to be able to see a lot of detail. I just want to show you what I created for the book. And the light here is very low. Let's see, hold on a second. Let's see if we can cast a little more light on it. And you can see it a little bit. Where Eden is, you've got the Tigris and the Euphrates coming from the southeast. And that's all Iran and Iraq and that whole area in there nowadays. And that's where Eden would have lay. All right? That gives you an idea. Now I've got the light shining in my eyes. So let's just avert that. I'm averting my eyes, oh Lord. All right. The reign of Eden, or region of Eden, although there's no way to absolutely be sure of its precise location, the Garden of Eden was most likely just to the northwest of the budding Sumerian civilization. The Genesis narrative places the garden between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, flanked by the Gihon and the Pishon rivers, both of whose courses have altered over the millennia due to geologic catastrophe, yet not so much so that the approximate location of the Garden of Eden was rendered a complete mystery. Now, I also find it very interesting when we say that Moses, when he wrote the book of Genesis, hold on. Phew. When he wrote the book of Genesis, he incorporated things from Sumerian culture, Mesopotamian culture, which is right smack in the middle of all of this. And so this being the kind of cradle of civilization, as they called it, moved into the Canaanite region where the Hebrews picked it up. Now, take a different look at the events that took place there. The Hebrew word used in the book of Genesis for the word snake is nakash. Now, we've talked about this a few times. It's meaning magician or enchanter, a spellbinder, to illuminate, to shine. And the Jewish rabbinic interpretation never saw this word as meaning a literal snake at all. It was to be understood as a shining being with power to enchant. This is a far cry from a snake in the grass, and in many theological interpretations is none other than Lucifer himself, although the passage itself never actually calls him out by that name. It is this being that influences Eve, or beguiles her, in a more accurate sense, into eating the fruit of the forbidden tree in the midst of the Garden of Eden. It says in Genesis 3, 2-3, the woman said to the serpent, "We may eat from the trees in the garden, but God did say, you must not eat fruit from the tree that is in the middle of the garden, and you must not touch it, or you will die." The Hebrew word for the tree is pronounced etz, E-T-S. It's a word that is in a very close association with the Hebrew word toledah, both meaning generations. It is from these words that we draw the modern equivalent of family tree. Another variation of the word etz is the wood of the tree as an opening and closing of a door. In an applicational stretch, the same word can apply to the term portal, or opening of one's mind, or enlightenment. So you got to stretch it a little bit, but it works. It has been in some circles suggested that the tree of knowledge of good and evil, from which Eve is said to have eaten the forbidden fruit, was not a literal tree at all, but rather symbolic of the pre-Adamic races that lived in the regions surrounding the Garden of Eden. These races are said to encompass the Atlantean civilization. The phrase, and you find Atlantis everywhere, don't you? The phrase "fruit of the tree" is the Hebrew word periri. It's P-E-R-I-Y, peri. We'll say peri. Fruit, produce of the ground, offspring, children, progeny of the womb, or figuratively fruit or of actions. The phrase "eat of it" is the Hebrew word akal. This word many times has many uses, among which one use means to lay with a woman or sexual intercourse. And the word touch is the Hebrew nagah. To touch, that is, to lay hand upon for any purpose. Euphemism for to touch, to have sex with a woman. So, Genesis 3, 4-7. "You will not certainly die," the serpent said to the woman, "for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. And when the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye, and also desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some and ate it. She also gave some to her husband, who was with her, and he ate it. Then they both of them, their eyes were opened, and they realized they were naked. So they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves." Now, this was obviously no ordinary tree we're talking about here. In fact, it wasn't a literal tree at all, many think. Many biblical scholars interpret this as Lucifer himself. The phrase "pleasant to the eyes" is the Hebrew word shamad, to desire, to covet, to take pleasure in, to delight in, to be desirable, to delight greatly, to desire greatly, desirableness and preciousness. The word desired is the Hebrew word ta'ava. ta'ava, to yearn for, to lust after, used of bodily appetites, a longing by implication, a delight, subjectivity, satisfaction, objectivity, a charm, a desire, a wish, a longing of one's heart, lust, an appetite, covetousness in a bad sense, to covet and to want longingly. Took is the Hebrew word lakak. It's a primitive root, to take in the widest variety of applications, to take as in Abraham took his cloak in his hand, to lay hold of, to receive, to marry, to take a wife, to take to or for a person, to procure, to get, to take possession of, to select, to choose, to take in marriage, to receive, to accept. It's a breakdown of all the words being used in Genesis here. A very different picture of Eve's temptation in the Garden of Eden is beginning to emerge. The previous parsed passage is far more than a sinful, disobedient application and appreciation of fruit. All the references we hear of Eve eating an apple, or depictions in religious art of the Eden couple eating a big piece of fruit, is merely encoded information and hiding what the passage truly speaks about. Now, it's obvious here that the snake was a symbol and not a literal talking snake selling apples. If you look up the words used in Genesis from a Strong's Concordance, you will then see that Genesis is filled with many sexual idioms. In fact, the picture of the snake eating dust is a Jewish idiom for being lower than low. To take it literally is a mistake. Note, too, that there are no snakes that eat dust. Also, that male penis strongly resembles a snake in its shape. So I don't think that we're dealing with a literal snake. And what was the law that Eve broke that was in transgression of? I would think it's clear that she was in transgression because she had committed adultery. And it says that Adam did too partake in the eating of the fruit and became ashamed. But this fruit did not come directly from this tree, but from Eve. And I've got a footnote there. It's footnote number 932. But I tell you what, that 932, maybe ninth for the chapter. But I will tell you this, I don't know where that came from off the top of my head without looking to the bibliography. But are you getting a little different picture of what happened with Adam and Eve? I've said it was kind of like a sexual three-way, if you will, in the garden, that the great sin was not eating fruit. That's a word picture of what happened. It was the bringing of sexuality and Eve sharing this with Nakash and then also with Adam, which then bore twins. According to 1 Enoch 69, 4 through 12, the serpent was one of the 5 angels known as the 5 Satans. And one of those Satans was named Gadarel, and was he who showed the children of the people all the blows of death, who misled Eve, who showed the children of the people how to make the instruments of death, such as the shield, the breastplate, and the sword for warfare, and all the other instruments of death to the children of the people. What really happened in this scene in the Garden of Eden is that Eve, the mother of humanity, lost her virginity to the serpent. You can see that she encountered him sexually before ever having had sex with her husband Adam. And later in the passage, the text is implicit that Eve was impregnated by this encounter. Then she drew her husband into the scenario, took, and Eve also became impregnated by Adam. Eve was then bearing fraternal twins, Cain and Abel, one from the seed of Adam and the other from the seed of the character known as the serpent in the garden. By the way, this is a medical fact. There are women who have born twins that are sometimes even of different races, yet the babies are twins, because she was impregnated by 2 different men. The grand sin that was committed in Eden was not mere disobedience in the eating of a forbidden piece of fruit from a forbidden tree in the middle of the garden. It was a sexual sin that created a dual bloodline in the twins conceived in Eve's womb. According to the subsequent passages in Genesis, we learn that Abel was the blood seed of Adam, but that Cain was the blood seed of the serpent, and that those opposing lineages would be in constant conflict with one another, starting with Cain murdering his twin brother. Here we see that events in the Garden of Eden were greatly influenced by none other than a reptilian caretaker. Theologically, you could pigeonhole him as Lucifer or Satan, taking the form of a snake. But even in that form, he would have had to have possessed the physical ability to have sexual intercourse with Eve. So the reptilian feature is mere poetic biblical language, or it represents the physical appearance and qualities of the person who tempted Eve. In a very real sense, then, Cain, the seed of the serpent, was for all practical purposes the very first of the Nephilim, bequeathed by a fallen angel, perhaps even Lucifer himself. Whoever the serpent truly is, there have been linkages made between the obviously coded message of the Adam and Eve story with the beings that descended to the slopes of Mount Hermon and bred with human women 7 generations later. But this is the serpent's seed planted in the Garden of Eden, only the first of many such recorded events in biblical history. Oh, actually, that was a question. Was this? So was the seed of the serpent something that was planted in the womb of Eve, only to be done again and again and again in the wombs of other women in both the pre-flood and post-flood worlds? And was the serpent himself, obviously not a snake or a man, a member of an angelic caste, or even Lucifer, as some suggest, or was he something completely different? How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning, says Isaiah 14:12. And I beheld Satan as lightning fall from heaven. So said Jesus Christ, quoted in Luke 10:18. And now we move on to a section on page 109 called The Reptilians. Let me just see if there's anybody who's got anything profound I need to address. There's a message held for review. I'm not sure what that one is. Funny the Rat Bastard. I'll show that. Let's see. Rare to find someone who knows the store of Lilith. And kudos. Yes, I was asking for a friend. Kitten said, an apple a day keeps the doctor away. Mm-hmm. So, Eve was a floozy. Yeah, you could say that. The interesting thing is, according to some theologians, Adam and Eve had not had sexual intercourse at this point. This is supposed to be very early on in their existence. This whole thing about the tree eating the fruit, that was like bing bang, thank you ma'am, right away. So it's said that what Nakash, the serpent character, introduced to Eve was sex. And the outcome was she brought it to Adam. She bequeathed twins and this dual bloodline. So let's move on. The Reptilians. The presence of a reptoid character in the Bible account of the Garden of Eden and the temptation of Eve has given rise to countless pop cultural mythologies, theories, and anecdotal personal encounters about a race of alien reptilian beings that interfered with human development and history. And they are linked closely with the Nephilim, the Anunnaki, the sons of God of Genesis chapter 6. The only problem with most of the theorizing, despite how intriguing and possible the claims may be, is that it is just that, theorizing and speculation. There are countless numbers of books and websites that host a plethora of information about the reptilians that lived on this planet more than 800,000 years ago. Hailing from the Draco star system, the vast majority of these fonts of reptilian information have no source points, no data, no cited facts. The entire reptilian issue seems to be summed up as accepted fact in particular circles of alien and ufological thought, but they offer us no solid evidence or empirical data to use as a foundation. No evidence, no verification, no historical records, much like most of our belief systems structured around the characters and events in the Bible itself. In his book, The Big Secret, British-born New Ageist David Icke, who I'm sure you've all heard of, one of the most well-known authors and lecturers on alien reptilians, speaks of their involvement with the human race through his own Gaussian-blurred view of both historical and current events. For Icke, the reptilian factor is an otherworldly platform to use as a launching pad for his anti-Semitic neo-fascism and an ostensibly oddball convergence of New Age thinking with Nazi philosophy that he incorporates into the foundation for his belief that mankind has always been controlled and governed by a global Jewish conspiracy fathered by lizards from another planet. Let that sink in for a second next time you think of David Icke. I always wanted to interview him, but after I wrote my books, I thought he's never going to talk to me. This merely illustrates that the topic of alien reptilians is comprised of more speculative ranting, subjective storytelling, and wishful thinking than quantifiable historical or anthropological fact. Even the header on Icke's website states that he is exposing the dream world we believe to be real. Reality can be stronger than fiction. It has been said, yet when we see the exposing of ideas from people who seem to have slippery holds on historical accuracy, let alone common sense and sanity, we tend to laugh them off into the other room and seat them at the children's table so they can do their thing while we adults converse at the grown-ups table about the hardcore truisms of life and the universe. However, as crackpot as some of the ideas surrounding reptilians may sound, and whatever pseudo-political ideologies have been built on their shoulders, a kernel of truth may still lie quivering at the core. Although reptilian art and religious application of serpents and dragons all exist all throughout human history, there is little, if any, evidence that they dwelled on this planet and interacted with human beings on the level that is exposed in the theorizing of pseudoscientific thought. Excuse me. Yet their presence, in one form or another, is pervasive and ultimately convincing to a certain degree. I got to tell you, sitting on the little shelf behind me here is my book on the reptilians, which was the follow-up to this. And I subtitled this book. There's the book on the reptilians. And I subtitled this book, The Pervasive Presence of the Serpent in Human History, Religion, and Alien Mythos. So that kind of gives you an idea of where my head was. And I kind of drew the title of that book, I think, from that last paragraph I just read. So, reality can be stranger than fiction. Okay, I read that. Snake on a stick is the next section. The remarkable fact is that throughout all ancient and modern civilizations, the serpent or dragon bestowing knowledge upon the human race figures prominently in all religions and histories. The Judeo-Christian reptilian fallen angel Lucifer, the Mayan serpent god Quetzalcoatl, the enormous plumed serpent god of the Hopi Indians. I can't even pronounce this one. Baholinkanga. The East Indian mystical human-like reptilians known as Nagas. The Egyptian serpent god Anuf. And the Phoenicians Agathodaman. And even the Hebrews Nakushtan, or brazen serpent, that Moses cast and placed high on a pole when the Israelites were plagued by serpents in the wilderness, which is a biblical scene all on its own that begs the question of more encoded language from Moses. The actual passage reads like this. They traveled from Mount Hor, that's H-O-R, for those of you who would take to that lightly, along the route to the Red Sea to go around Edom. But the people grew impatient on the way. They spoke against God and against Moses and said, "Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? There is no bread, there is no water. We detest this miserable food." Then the Lord sent venomous snakes among them, and they bit the people, and many Israelites died. The people came to Moses and said, "We've sinned when we spoke against the Lord and against you. Pray that the Lord will take the snakes away from us." So Moses prayed for the people. The Lord said to Moses, "Make a snake, put it up on a pole. Anyone who's bitten can look at it and live." So Moses made a bronze snake and put it up on a pole. Then when anyone was bitten by a snake and looked at the bronze snake, they lived. Numbers 21, 4-9. Now, I always thought, if God's going to bring the snakes to punish his people, and then he also makes a way to cure them by having Moses cast a snake in bronze and raise it on the pole, I don't understand God of the Old Testament sometimes. I'm going to wipe you all out with snakes. But okay, Moses prayed. So instead of just taking the snakes away and healing you, which I apparently have the power to do, I'm going to make Moses cast a snake out of bronze, put it up on a pole. All of those of you getting bitten in between, sorry, timing's off. So as a punishment for griping and complaining against God and Moses, the biblical account written by Moses tells us that God sent fiery serpents into the camp of the wandering Israelites. The people were being bitten and dying in hordes. So God instructed Moses to cast a bronze snake, place it high on a pole, and all who were bitten and taken ill could look on the serpent from anywhere within the camp and be healed. The brazen serpent remained with the Israelites for another 700 years, where it evidently stood in the temple in Jerusalem. But the people during the time of King Hezekiah had begun worshiping the snake and making an offering to it. So in a vast iconoclastic reform, Hezekiah cut down all the pagan groves, smashed all the idols, and destroyed the Nehushtan, which didn't bear that name until his reign on the throne of Israel, suggesting that he may have given it that name himself. It is interesting to note that originally the second commandment written by Moses included this prohibition: "You shall not make for yourselves an idol, whether in the form of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on the earth beneath, or that is in the water underneath the earth." This mandate was so strong in its wording that Jews incorporated into their laws an extremist prohibition against portraiture and sculpted imagery of any kind, of man, beast, animal, or deity, illustrating the power of Jewish law. Two first-century Jewish historians, Philo and Josephus, recorded revolts by the Jews during the tenure of the Roman prefect Pontius Pilate, 26 through 36 AD, over the placement of graven images and effigies. According to Josephus, Pilate demonstrated a fairly insensitive approach to the Jews' religious customs, and he ignored their protests by allowing his soldiers to bring the images of Caesar into the city by the dark of night. This is statuary and shields with his images and things like that. When the citizens of Jerusalem discovered the following day law, Pilate finally removed the images. The incident proved to be an early example of effective resistance to tyranny by aggressive, nonviolent means. Yet Pilate quelled the rebellion by signaling other of his plainclothes troops who had positioned themselves within the crowds to begin a very brief but bloody massacre of many of the protesters. Philo describes, or Philo as some say, a similar incident in which Pilate was officially reprimanded by Emperor Tiberius after antagonizing the Jews by setting up gold-coated shields in Herod's palace in Jerusalem. The shields were ostensibly to honor Tiberius, and this time did not contain engraved images. Philo writes that the shields were set up not so much to honor Tiberius as to annoy the multitude. The Jews protested the installation of the shields at first to Pilate, and then when he declined to remove them by writing to Tiberius. Philo reports that upon reading the letters, Tiberius wrote to Pilate with a host of reproaches and rebukes for his audacious violation of the precedent, and bade him at once to take down the shields and have them transferred from the capital to Caesarea. Now, by the way, there's an historical note here. It used to be thought that Pilate was part of the Jesus myth because there was no hardcore evidence that he ever existed. That is until about 1964-65, when an archaeological team in Caesarea Philippi, which is the Roman capital of Judea, uncovered a stairway that had been built out of old blocks of stone from demolished buildings in antiquity. And what they found was the cornerstone bearing the inscription of Pontius Pilate, dedicating a gymnasium to Tiberius Caesar. And that stands in the Jerusalem Museum now. But the interesting point to all of that is that Pilate, with this problem with Caesar, and Caesar chastising him for antagonizing the Jews, this is the same guy who, not very much later, the Jews said, give us a writ of execution for this one Jesus of Nazareth, or we'll tell Caesar that you're honoring another king. So the interesting point being made there was that I think Pilate kind of was a little tender from being chewed out by Caesar and didn't need that to happen again. And that's why him not having any knowledge of who this Jesus was or even caring about it, did a writ of execution, washed his hands of it, as it said. He just wanted it done and over with. Otherwise, they were going to tattle to Caesar on him. All right, the point is that the Jewish law forbade iconoclastic imagery of any kind in a preemptive strife to stave off idol worship. But the brazen serpent was an exception, and it was imbued with divine power to cure illness and heal snake bites. And the people eventually worshipped it as a result, although centuries later. The worship of the serpent grew out of the fact that the serpent is so represented in creation scripture as the god of the earth. But he's also clearly represented as being subservient to the higher divine. Elohim, who curses him in coded symbolic language in Genesis 3 as a result of the seduction of Eve. And although it is true that the Bible itself never uses the word reptilian, but serpent, and it is clear that the serpent is not simply a snake, there are only 4 characters mentioned in the dawn of mankind in the Garden of Eden: God, Adam, Eve, and the serpent. Ancient Jewish beliefs about this serpent explicitly state that it had arms and legs and walked upright. This claim is found in the Bereshit Rabbah, an ancient Jewish commentary on the book of Genesis. While dealing with the story of the Garden of Eden, the Midrash also deals with the serpent. It declares that before causing Adam and Eve to sin, it had legs. That's in Bereshit Rabbah 19. According to this, the serpent was once tall, splendid, and regal creature. When its fate was decided and it's written, "Upon thy belly thou shalt go," the ministering angels descended and cut off its arms and legs. Bereshit Rabbah 20. This descriptive tradition gives the physical image of the enticing serpent an impressive dimension that has repercussion on many viewpoints of the ancient world, which saw the serpent as representing forces of evil on one hand and as possessing supernatural powers and prowess on the other. Down through the ages, the description of the reptilian archetypical being that Adam and Eve may have encountered has been altered and evolved. By calling it a serpent and nothing more, biblical revisionists have effectively simplified the description and robbed humanity of a more mysterious and possibly accurate reality of which we are only now recognizing. Another point that should also be noted is that in the book of Genesis, Elohim condemns the serpent by saying, "On your belly you shall go," which suggests he wasn't on it before. The ancient Jewish accounts of the Garden of Eden describe a being that is more like the ufological extraterrestrial reptoids than just a plain serpent. They also tell how the reptilians' behavior amid a subterranean realm They also tell of how the reptilians' behavior amid early mankind resulted in their being cast down to the earth, hinting at a subterranean realm, having all traces of hands, feet, and the ability to walk upright, hidden from the surface-dwelling humans, erased from man's memories, and placed permanently out of sight. All right? Let's move on. Let's see. The mighty men of renown. In Genesis 6:4, it states, "The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came to the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men who were of old men of renown." There is an alternate, not so pretty picture of the motivation behind the descent of the Watchers, and that is the story of enslavement and the breeding of a worker class by a superior race of extraterrestrial beings perceived by the simple-minded humans as divinity. The hominids found on Earth by the Watchers, the divine caste set in place, according to Scripture to protect and watch over the Earth, were bettered by the genetic interbreeding of a superior extraterrestrial race for the purpose of creating a slave caste. Accordingly, the Watchers, as described in the religious Hebrew texts, were none other than the beings of the superior intellect, strength, and technical advancement who saw opportunity to subjugate a lesser race, improving them by impregnation or genetic tampering. It is also a wave of thought that among ancient alienists, that the interbreeding mentioned in this Genesis and Enochian accounts was ancient, poetic, picturesque, coded language used to describe what would be described in our modern terminology as cloning and genetic engineering. The book of Genesis tells us that the offspring of the cohabitation between the Watchers and humans were known as the heroes of old, and the mighty men of renown, the Gibborim, the Hebrew word for mightiest, the intensive noun for Gabar, or mighty. The word was many times used to describe the valiant brave of the great stature. But in this usage of the word in Genesis chapter 6, it speaks of a class of beings in its description of the Nephilim as being mighty. The word Gibborim is also used more than 150 times in the Tanakh, an acronym formed from the initial Hebrew letters of the Masoretic text's three traditional subdivisions: the Torah, the teaching known as the 5 books of Moses, the Nevim, or the prophets, and the Ketuvim, the writings, and is applied not only to the Nephilim and men, but also to lions, Proverbs 30:30, hunters, Genesis 10:9, soldiers, Jeremiah 51:30, and leaders, Daniel 11:3. The ancient divine connotation of the world is nearly lost in the modern usage of the word Gibbor, which means hero, and brave as a verb. The Gibborim have even made it into current-day pop culture. Marvel Comics has their Gibborim of the Demagogue, created by Brian K. Vaughan and Adrian Alfona, as a race of 3 six-fingered giants among the various elder gods of Earth, having somehow survived ancient judgmental catastrophe, whose goal is to wipe the earth clean of all humanity. Averaging a rough height of 100 feet, the Gibborim despise all humans. Despite the watering down of the ancient usage of the word and its further pop cultural diminutives, it is this class of crossbred mighty heroes, these Nephilim offspring of the Watchers, who begin the ravaging of humanity in the earth. It is also this race of hybrid offspring who are said to have begun the slave enforcement of mankind. As they grew in influence and power, the Gibborim began to extract more and more natural resources for their sustenance, and all the peoples of the earth who inhabited a relatively small region of what is now the Middle East were oppressed and completely entrenched in a slave caste societal bondage to these beings. It was this interplay and corruption that the book of Genesis hails to as the cause of the wickedness of mankind, the stench to the nostrils of God that had him grieving that he had ever created humankind on the earth. And that grieving was not only hatred of humans, but rather a deep agonizing on the part of the deity that he had created a race that was so easily manipulated and altered by the Watchers, his own emissaries. The course of action taken by the divine was to then wipe out the entire race of Nephilim Gibborim, as well as the rest of the tainted blood of humanity, in one great universal catastrophic judgment, the great flood of Noah. But to preserve the human race, Noah was chosen to build an ark, a great barge to preserve all animal life as well as one pure-blooded human family, his own. It seems impossible for we who exist at this far end of antiquity for such a salvational vessel to be created out of shittim wood and tree sap tar. As the Bible recounts, and even more implausible for a man and his 3 sons to take 120 years to build it than to gather 2 of every kind of animal in existence and to load it into its many stalls and chambers. Yet one must remember that the passage itself never says that Noah went out with lassos and ropes and a net to gather the species of animals. It says that they were brought to the ark divinely by God. And of course, as we are beginning to see, this act in and of itself is more likely than not one of 2 things: perfect in its illustrative descriptions and true to the scriptures as read, or poetic code language utilized to set in place a mythological cover story for an event that may have been nothing short of genetic storage at the hands of a much superior race understood by ancient man to be gods. How about that? That's a thought altogether, is that this whole idea or notion that you take a biblical or religious mythology of a guy building a big barge and taking 2 of every animal to preserve them, which is fantastical enough, to saying maybe that's just a cover story for the fact that an alien race was breeding on the planet and was storehousing, like you saw in Jurassic Park, in the shave can. You know, the guy had all the put in there. Maybe that's what we're looking at. But which story is more fantastical? That, or possibly just the evolutionary story? That's what we're trying to get at. All right, demonic interbreeding. According to Roman Catholic theology, fallen angels have been attempting to interbreed with mankind for the purposes of creating a perfect hybrid mix of demonic and human ever since the fall of man. The Watchers themselves were not demons, nor were they fallen angels, but their act of descending to the earth in defiance of the divine charge certainly placed them in a position of dangerous disobedience, as attested to by their leader. 1 Enoch 7, 3-4, then their leader Shemyaza said to them, the other prefects of the Watchers, I fear that you may perhaps be indisposed to the performance of this enterprise, intermingling with human women, and that I alone shall suffer for this so grievous a crime. Again, or against whom was Shemyaza concerned about committing a crime? God? A racial hierarchy? The humans? It is clear by this text that whoever Shemyaza really was, he was a bit nervous about his plans, as he alone would be held responsible, being their leader. He seemed to have a clear understanding that his act would bring hierarchical consequences, but he was, as the text indicates, immediately followed by the rest of the Grigori, and as we will see, they all bore the consequential brunt of their deeds. For it was this act on their collective part that placed them, at least in religious and scriptural terms, in the camp of the fallen angels, as some contend. Whereas the New Testament uses the Greek word demon to refer to these sons of the mighty, the Old Testament uses revealing descriptive names, words that describe these beings as B'nai Ha-Elohim, meaning sons of God, Zophim, meaning the watchers, and Malach, meaning messengers. This reference was translated to angel in English, are used for the aerial host, even regardless of alignment. The Book of Enoch tells us the origin of certain interdimensional intelligences, called in the monotheistic New Testament demons, who were understandably associated with evil, because originally the Greek term daimon meant any deity, was in the days of Noah, and it didn't end with the flood, but continued according to Genesis 6, even after. There are three main terms for demons in the New Testament. The daimonian, or demon, 60 times, 50 in the Gospels. Pneuma, spirit, or pneuma, 52 times, usually with a qualifying adjective such as akatharton, or unclean, 21 times, or poneron, evil, sight times, 8 times, I think that was. And I found a typo in my book. And angelos, 7 times, of demonic agencies. Daimon, or demon, the term commonly used in classical Greek, appears only once in Mark 8, verse 31. Now, on to divine judgment. Yes. Thanks, Mark. Yeah, not feeling well today and still up late. My brain is sharp as a metal sieve. So, divine judgment. Let's move on. We've only got a few pages left of this chapter. It's now 12:14, so we've been going at this for about 2 hours and 15 minutes. This is a longie, so we're almost wrapped up here. So keep sharp, because we'll go back and check for questions or anything. Divine judgment. In short, the reason for the flood, as recorded in the book of Genesis, was not an imposition of divine judgment on a race of humans who had simply grown too wicked for their own good. That would seem an awful waste of humanity, even for God himself, especially when there would have been much better ways to offer repentance and forgiveness, short of the complete destruction of the earth and all things dwelling on it. This entire issue of a great deluge being used simply to eradicate a race of sinners, sending them all to the eternal hell of infinite separation from God, is lost in its grandiosity, akin to dropping an atomic bomb in order to squash a beehive hanging from the cave of your house, the roof of your house, eave of your house. There we go. There had to be something more than simple matters of heart at play here, something more than a mere rejection of the laws of God on the part of a rebellious race of humans. Sin can be handled, according to the Bible, by a change of heart that does not require the extermination of an entire race. But what if what we have here in this story goes far beyond the wickedness of mankind and delves deep into the extermination of an extraterrestrially manipulated race that has corrupted humanity, bringing them wickedness through the mode of genetic corruption and alteration of DNA. What if the Great Flood was a means incorporated by a supreme being or a master superior race to kill the experiment that had gone badly awry, a wiping out of an experiment that had gone very, very wrong? In Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which she attested to have written as an allegory of God's creation of man and his subsequent fall from grace, a man is created by scientific experimenting with the reanimation of dead human flesh. The created being is highly intelligent and learns to read, write, and communicate on a near genius level, much unlike the monster that was made popular in the Boris Karloff movies in the 1930s. It was when this created man became corrupt and turned into the monster that his creator found it necessary to take his life, ending in a great pursuit that led them both to the frozen wastes of the Arctic and a fiery demise for them both. The creators of the hybrid race of the Nephilim found it necessary to eradicate them and their influence in humanity. But it didn't work. Even after the utter devastation of a universal flood, even after the collection of the DNA and or physical quarantine of every species of animal, the Bible tells us again that Genesis 6:4, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward. For the purest believer in the infallibility of God and Scripture, this notion would seem heresy and blasphemy. But that is, of course, if you follow the stricture of scriptural accounts of these things by the letter, not accounting for coded language and simplistic fabled cover stories for much greater events. All right, let's see. Yes, Jeannie, you see similarities to today's tumultuous times. I agree. All right. Here we go. Don't forget to thumbs up. There you go. Yeah, like this page. And by the way, if you're not subscribed, subscribe. And like this for me. The more likes I get, the more it looks like it's liked. And that helps me on YouTube. Outgrown and outmoded. On one side of the equation, humanity seems to have outgrown its need for traditional religious belief. The firmly held dogmas of the existence of a supreme being have become an outmoded mythology, only to be replaced with updated, more acceptable versions of what we think ancient mankind was experiencing. Did prehistoric humans encounter strange and wonderful beings so far advanced that they could only describe them within the framework of their scientific and spiritual understanding? It seems as if anything that lay in the realm of the mystical and unexplained, even in religious circles where we are already supposed to believe in great divine beings and miraculous deeds, there is a move away from anything that even smacks of the woo-woo that fringes on the mythological. There is some exceptional allowance for God and his angels, but nearly everything else falls under the category of we don't know that. However, on the flip side of that equation, I found that most people have their curiosities piqued when it comes to topics of UFOs, aliens, and extraterrestrial visitations. No matter how far outside their religious or denominational box those curiosities take them. Although they may want to accept that these things are highly possible, if not probable, they will stop haltingly short of any attempt to reconcile them with their pre-established religious belief system that focuses on traditional, omniscient, omnipresent, all-powerful God and his cast of angels. It's as if they want us to believe that these mysteries bear some truth. Thank you. I've been delivered a glass of water. I give you water, you give me your knowledge. All right, that was the lovely, luscious Rainy delivering me with some water. So pardon me. She must hear me coughing out there. And you know, I'd quit and finish the rest tomorrow, but we're so damn close to the end of this chapter, we're going to keep going. All right. So we have, let's see, where did I leave off? Blah, 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 blah. Although they may want to accept that these things are highly possible, if not probable, they will stop haltingly short of any attempt to reconcile them with their pre-established religious belief systems that focus on a traditional, omniscient, omnipresent, all-powerful God and his caste of angels. It's as if they want to believe that these mysteries bear some truth, but they're unwilling to allow these things to merge with their traditional religious beliefs and values. The things they may not even know for sure if they believe, but are unwilling to release. There is a dichotomous set of beliefs, one part wanting to accept that there are as of yet unexplained mysteries, and the other too afraid to say so, for fear of religious repercussions. I know so many people like that are set in their religious ways, yet they just can't accept the existence of ghosts, the existence of aliens. Oh, that's just too far-fetched. But they believe in all the biblical mysteries, the religious mythology. So there you go. I tend to take particular issue with the evangelical fundamentalist circles from which I hail in my younger days of church-going and ministry. Fundamentalist believers seem to have this intrinsic sense about them that should there be any veracity to the seemingly mounting evidences that extraterrestrials and alien visitors from other regions of the universe or dimensionalities truly exist, their religion and faith would somehow irreconcilably be shaken to its core, as if God's universe is not big enough to handle the existence of other races, off-planet, exosolar system. For these followers of hyperbolic forms of Christianity, the Bible's faith message of salvation and reconciliation is rendered null and void if there exists another race that does not fall under the same mandates as the Bible's descriptions of a fallen human race born in iniquity and in need of redemption. I faced this same sort of argument in those same fundamentalist circles when discussing, long before the book and the movie ever came out, the theories behind Dan Brown's highly provocative book, The Da Vinci Code, in which he engages the age-old theory that perhaps Jesus of Nazareth was a married man and had children. I had one old Bible school friend discount the notion completely, insisting that for Jesus to have been married would unravel the Nazarene's claim to being the Son of God, possessive of redemptive powers. This theological position, of course, was taken despite the fact that there are many evidences, inclusive of a rabbinic requirement for rabbis to be married men, suggesting that Jesus was indeed a married man. And in establishing the messianic author or authority of Jesus, the New Testament itself claims in Hebrews 4:15 that he experienced life in all manners just as we do. Yet the Christian fundamental view is that nothing exists outside the bounds of written scriptural text. And if it was ever proven that it does, that would somehow dissemble their faith in God, leaving them like so much wet laundry hanging out on the line, flapping in the wind, void of any solid religious structure or spiritual coherence. At the same time, the scriptures on which the foundations are built for faith and religious practice for most of these believers are rife with all sorts of references to clearly non-human, non-earthly beings, from angels to demons to devils to cherubim and seraphim, all the way up the ladder to God Almighty. The pages of traditional religious texts put on a perpetual cavalcade of non-human entities whose actions range from simple visitations to fiery flying chariots, to beings who descend to the earth, making a pact amongst themselves to impregnate the daughters of humanity. And I'll read once again, Genesis 6, 1 through 4. The number of people on the earth began to grow, and daughters were born to them. When the sons of God, Enoch refers to these same beings as watchers, saw that those girls were beautiful, they married any of them they chose. The Lord said, my spirit will not remain in human beings forever, because they are flesh. They will live only 120 years. And the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also after. That was when the sons of God had sexual relations with the daughters of human beings. These women gave birth to children who became famous and were the mighty warriors of long ago. The big question is, are they gods and angels and devils, or did earthly man simply ascribe those titles within the construct of their understanding? What most faith-based believers in the Bible fail to recognize is the fact that the Bible is full of references to other intelligence and non-human entities. These beings are generally said by the theological intelligentsia to be the angelic beings or demonic entities, rather than any sort of extraterrestrial alien presence. The Apostle Paul, who started out as Saul of Tarsus, a persecutor of the early church Christians, had set out to Damascus carrying with him the death warrants for members of the Christian movement there. As he and his entourage were on the road, it is said a shaft of life blazed down out of the sky, casting Saul to the ground. No one else in his party heard a word, but later Saul recounted a tale of God speaking to him in the form of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. This was said by Saul to be his conversion experience, and he changed his name to Paul. Was this an encounter with a member of the divine council, who later manifested as the Son of God, the Jewish Messiah? Paul had an apparently life-changing, out-of-body or near-death experience in which he saw things which it is not lawful for man to speak. I have often wondered what it was that he saw and why he was never permitted to say anything about it, or why he denied us access to his word on it. But it is apparent that the experience made such an indelible mark on Paul's life that he could not even speak of it in the first person. And we'll move on from that, because we all know where this story of Paul goes. I'm using it merely to illustrate non-human personages doing things. The star system of Orion, Pleiades, and Arcturus are mentioned by name in the chronologically oldest book of the Old Testament, the book of Job. It says in Job 9:9, he is the maker of the bear, Ursa Major, and Orion, the Pleiades, and the clustered stars, Arcturus of the south. And then again in 38:31 of Job, can you bind the beautiful Pleiades? Can you loose the cords of Orion? So I thought that was very interesting that Job, a pre-Judaic religion story, the oldest chronologically in the Bible, has the main character referencing these certain constellations. Went blank on the word for a second there. So I think it's very interesting that he looked to these things. They were part of ancient religions of his day. Let's move on. The high priest of El Elyon, the Most High God, and king of the city of Salem, the ancient city of Jerusalem, was a man named Melchizedek, who, according to Hebrews 7:3, had neither beginning nor end of days, and who mysteriously appeared in Abraham's time, resembling a, quote, son of God, end quote. Hebrews 7:3 said, he is without father or mother or genealogy, having neither beginning nor end of days of life, but resembling the Son of God, he continues a priest forever. The Apostle John, in his dotage on the Isle of Patmos, some 60 years after he walked as a disciple with Jesus, had a most profound apocalyptic vision, which dealt with numerous non-human intelligences. In just the first of many sections of the book of Revelation, filled with strange beasts and ostentatious visions, John wrote, this is out of the book of Revelation, I, John, your brother and companion in the suffering and kingdom and patient endurance that are ours in Jesus, was on the island of Patmos because the word of God and the testimony of Jesus. On the Lord's day I was in the Spirit, and I heard behind me a loud voice like a trumpet, which said, Write on a scroll what you see and send it to the 7 churches, to Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. I turned around to see the voice that was speaking to me, and when I turned, I saw 7 golden lampstands, and among the lampstands was someone like a son of God, dressed in a robe reaching down to his feet, and with a golden sash around his chest. His head and hair were white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were like blazing fire. His feet were like bronze glowing in a furnace, and his voice was like the sound of rushing waters. In his right hand he held 7 stars, and out of his mouth came a sharp double-edged sword. His face was like the sun, shining in all its brilliance. Who else had that happen? Moses, remember? And when I saw him, I fell at his feet as though dead. Then he placed his right hand on me and said, Don't be afraid. I'm the first and the last, the Alpha and Omega. I am the living one. I was dead, and behold, I am alive forever and ever. And I hold the keys of death and Hades. Interesting description. Some might say John in his dotage was smoking a little too much Patmosian weed. But that's quite a vision that he delivers for the whole book of Revelation. Next point is, as we covered extensively, the Hebrew slaves were led out of bondage in Egypt under the leadership of Moses, and were guided by a pillar of fire by day and a pillar of cloud by night. Or other way around. Fire by night, pillar of cloud by day. Both were seen for 40 years, leading the way through the skies. Ezekiel saw what has been described as a flying saucer. NASA spacecraft engineer John F. Blumrich had read Eric von Daniken's Chariots of the Gods. In the book, von Daniken described Ezekiel's vision as none other than a flying disc. Blumrich immediately set out to disprove von Daniken's theory, but upon further examination, found that the vision in Ezekiel was nearly identical to a proposed craft design that he had invented himself. So he did an engineering analysis and worked out a preliminary design for the craft. He later wrote his findings in his book entitled The Spaceships of the Prophet Ezekiel. Here's the description of what Ezekiel saw. In the 13th year, in the 4th month, on the 5th day, while I was among the exiles by the Kibar River, the heavens were open, and I saw visions of God. On the 5th of the month, it was the 5th year of the exile of King Jehoiakim. The word of the Lord came to Ezekiel the priest, the son of Buzi, by the Kibar River in the land of the Babylonians. There the hand of the Lord was upon him. As I looked, behold, a storm wind was coming from the north, a great cloud with fire flashing forth continually, and a bright light around it, and in its midst something glowing metal in the midst of the fire. Within it there were figures resembling 4 living beings, and this was their appearance. This is a long passage, by the way, out of the Old Testament. They had human form. Each of them had 4 faces and 4 wings. Their legs were straight and their feet were like a calf's hoof, and they gleamed like burnished bronze. Under their wings on the 4 sides were human hands. As for the faces and the wings of the 4 of them, their wings touched one another. Their faces did not turn when they moved. Each went straight forward. As for the form of their faces, each had the face of a man. All 4 had the face of a lion on the right, and the face of a bull on the left, and all four had the face of an eagle. Such were their faces. Their wings were spread out above, each had two touching another being, and two covering their bodies, and each went straight forward. Wherever the spirit was about to go, they would go, without turning as they went. In the midst of the living beings, there was something that looked like burning coals of fire, like torches darting back and forth among the living beings. The fire was bright, and lightning was flashing from the fire, and the living beings ran to and fro like bolts of lightning. Now as I looked in the living beings, behold, there was one wheel on the earth, beside the living beings, for each of the four of them. The appearance of the wheels and their workmanship was like sparkling beryl, and all four of them had the same form, their appearance and workmanship being as if one wheel were within another. Whenever they moved in any of their four directions without turning as they moved. As for their rims, they were lofty and awesome, and the rims of all four of them were full of eyes round about. Whenever the living beings moved, the wheels moved with them. And whenever the living beings rose from the earth, the wheels rose also. Whenever the spirit was about to go, they would go in that direction. And the wheels rose close beside them, for the spirit of the living beings was in the wheels. Whenever those went, and whenever those stood still, those stood still. And whatever those rose from the earth, the wheels rose close beside them, for the spirit of the living beings was in the wheels. Now over the heads of the living beings, there was something like an expanse, like the awesome gleam of crystal spread out over their heads. Under the expanse of their wings were stretched out straight, one toward the other. Each one also had two wings covering its body, on the one side and on the other. I also heard the sound of their wings, like the sound of abundant waters as they went, like the voice of the Almighty, a sound of tumult, like the sound of an army camp. Whenever they stood still, they dropped their wings. And there came a voice from above the expanse that was over their heads. Whenever they stood still, they dropped their wings. Now above the expanse that was over their heads, there was something resembling a throne, like lapis lazuli in appearance. And on that which resembled a throne, high up, was a figure with the appearance of a man. Then I noticed from the appearance of his loins, and upheld something like a glowing metal that looked like fire all around within it. And from the appearance of his loins and downward, I saw something like fire, and there was a radiance around him, as the appearance of the rainbow in the clouds on a rainy day, so was the appearance of the surrounding radiance. Such was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. And when I saw it, I fell on my face and heard a voice speaking. A mobile star guided three astrologers from the region of Babylon to the birthplace of Jesus Christ, mentioned only in the Gospel of Matthew, but not in the others. Even the Gospel of Luke omits the presence of the star, which is interesting, as Luke, who also wrote the New Testament book of Acts, was a physician and a historian. There are some who believe the star never actually existed, as it was recorded in no other historical star and its fanciful movement through the skies. However, if these wise men saw the star in the east, or better from the east, it would have taken months, if not a year or two, to decipher the star's meaning and follow it to to Judea. Whatever the star was, it probably did not happen at one moment, on one night, but over the course of several months as a portent in the sky. The appearances of both angels and demons were apparently relatively commonplace throughout the whole of biblically documented history. And there we have it. Chapter 5 in its entirety. all 48 pages. And so next time we read, which might not be tomorrow, it might be, we'll see how my day goes, is chapter 6, and it's called Alien Influence. And that's where we delve into this whole alien mythology thing even deeper. So let me take a look at some of your comments. I know we have been going for 2 hours and 45 minutes, just about. So there might have been a lot of questions in between. I tried to hit some as we were going. Sorry, I've got to put on my reflective cheaters here. It reflects all the light in the room. So, epic read, says Michelle. Thank you. And Mark says, thank you for reading to us tonight. Much appreciated. Thank you for being here to listen. Michelle says, I'm legendary. Why, thank you. That reminds me of that Antonio Banderas line from Zorro. The legendary Zorro. All right. So, let's just go back a little bit and just see if there's anything. Wow, long chat room tonight, obviously, for a long read. I'm going to just see if I see anything that sticks out. Poe's 13 Magical Mystery Stores, soon to stock Scotty's books. Oh, fantastic. Thank you, Mark. Have to come and visit. Let's see. I'm just going to see if there's anything that really sticks out since we've already gone quite a bit of time tonight. Enjoyed the reading, says Casper. Looks like he had to take off. Thank you, Casper, for being here. Patrick was Jesuit and destroyed the Druids, says Jeannie. That's very true. The separation is not easy, especially due to the government. Wondered about Ike, David Ike, exactly. And I don't want to insult David Ike unnecessarily. I just think he either knows something we all don't know or he's a crackpot. It's one of the two. So he seems very convinced of the things he says. Brian Parker says his problem with Ike is that he offers no solutions. But I do have the background info about him. In my book on the Reptilians, the follow-up to this one, I write a little bit more about David Ike and his past. I've often wondered about Ike because he names names and all that, but still trying to keep exposing. His answer to that is, I'm protected. I don't buy it. I don't either, Brian. Let's see. I'm not going to go back much further than that. Protected by high ups. That's even more scary. This is Brian Parker. Mark has his theory about Ike. He says, but it's my forum. It's okay to state your theories in here if you want. Just claim them so nobody else does. Let's see. Okay, I don't see much else that really I need to, unless I'm really missing some big things. There's not much else I really need to address as far as questions go. Yes, tea with honey and lemon would be good right now. I think my voice held up actually very well. It's just I've got junk in my chest today. So try to get beyond that. And I was pretty worn out today. So similarities for today sounds kind of like it was some sort of experiment regarding the testing the resolve of man. How would he fight to exist? There's that, Audrey. I like before the podcast starts because I know it's going to be good. Thank you, Mark. I appreciate that. I'm glad you haven't been disappointed yet. Rainey is fabulous, isn't she, Audrey? Didn't know it takes some Nephilim on the ark. No clue. Absolutely whatsoever on that one. I think Noah had the knowledge to bring embryos and all types of life on Earth, just thinking it would be possible. Ask your pastor, is he married? So who's without sin? Yeah, it's very interesting. I do a whole thing on Jesus and the wedding at Cana. We'll talk about that sometime, just on my regular stream. Looking to stars from Egypt. Yes, they say Egypt. They say Babylon. When you were in Patmos, the priests wouldn't shake women's hands, only men. Yeah, that's kind of some of that could be a cultural thing. Some of that could be a religious thing. I'm not sure anymore. All right, everybody. Well, thanks. The rest is kind of thanks for being here and all that. And there's Heather White, my friend from Scotland. How you doing, Heather? Good to see you. All right. So I'm glad you're here. She says, I've read this. Just good to be here and to hear it. Well, thank you very much. And once again, it was, pardon my sticking up here, because I've just been sitting around all day. And I think I did all right for being a little under the weather. And it was a marathon read tonight. 2 hours and 48 minutes we have now gone. So I want to thank you all for being here. If anybody's got anything at the last minute you want me to address or answer or speak to, go ahead and just throw it in there at the very end. Otherwise, I'm going to call it a night. And I appreciate you all being here. If tomorrow goes well, I'll be back tomorrow night and we'll do this. Again, otherwise it could be Sunday or Monday night. Might take the weekend off. We'll see how it goes. I enjoy this, by the way. As much as you say you enjoy it, I enjoy doing it. So once again, thanks for being here. I'm going to sign us off, and we'll be back next time with the chapter 6. Watch for the, you'll get notifications if you hit the little bell. I'll also, over in Facebook, I'll put up an announcement, and I'll put up a timer here on the website or on the YouTube page. So thanks, folks, for being here. I'll see you next time. I appreciate more than you can. I appreciate it more than you can know. Have a good night. Bye.